Welcome back to another episode of Women in Focus. We've got an amazing woman today in our studios, and I'm holding two of her books. We'll show a close-up of this for you in a minute. And she is here with the Taha Prize giveaways. Her name is Balli Kaur Jaswal, and she is our Woman in Focus today. Balli, you're most welcome in our program. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm a little bit jet lagged. Oh. I just arrived in Vancouver yesterday.
Oh, did you really?
Yes.
Okay, so now where are you from? I mean, I know you were born in Singapore, but you are a well-traveled woman.
Yeah. Yeah, where are you from is always a very complicated question for me. There's no one-word answer for me. Yes, so I'm from Singapore. I live there now, and I'm a citizen of Singapore. So I guess that's the most straightforward answer.
Okay.
But, you know, I come from the Punjabi diaspora, so I'm Punjabi Singaporean, and then I also grew up in various different countries because of my father's job.
Okay, so I understand you've lived in Japan, and you've lived in Australia, and you've lived in the US. So what does your dad do?
So my dad's a diplomat.
Okay.
So he works for Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Right.
So it meant that we moved to different places every couple of years.
So as a child, growing up in Singapore, how was it?
It was great in a lot of ways, and then it was also sometimes alienating in other ways. What I loved about Singapore was the openness of space that we had to, and the safety and the fact that we could just kind of be out and about, with playing with the neighborhood kids. Which is something that my son enjoys now. It's the infrastructure is very child friendly, and it was back then as well. But I'm part of a minority group within a minority group in Singapore. So Indians are a minority group in Singapore, and Punjabis are a minority within the Indian minority group. So having to explain myself constantly, having to say, yes, I'm a minority, but no, I don't, I'm not South Indian, which is Tamil is the
predominant
major,
language.
The predominant Indian language spoken, and Hinduism as well as a predominant Indian religion practiced. And so having to grapple with being a minority within a minority, and then also because I lived in different countries, when we lived overseas and we'd moved back to Singapore, there was all this explaining I had to do all over again of, no, I'm actually from here. Yes, I know I came from elsewhere, but I'm not from there either. So I constantly felt like an outsider. And that had its rewards as well. It was fun to, it made me feel quite unique. It made me feel like I had this kind of protective armor around me, but it could also feel very isolating sometimes.
I bet it would, but the experiences that you gather in all the places that you have lived probably enhances your thinking as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think when you look at the world from the perspective of an outsider, you tend to write from that perspective as well, and it just brings different insights into the things that you're writing, because you're automatically writing about the complexity of grappling with different things in your identity, and that in itself creates conflict.
It does.
So when you've got a larger narrative, you've already got a character who's got lots of internal conflict to deal with. Yeah.
So growing up in Singapore and then moving from place to place, did it affect your education at all?
It did, yeah. So when we moved to places outside of Singapore, I had a chance to attend international schools, which I very much preferred because there was a
standard to it.
There was a standard, and in Singapore, things were still done in a very kind of rote way. When I was growing up, everything was still very exam based, and so there was a very kind of it felt like there was a very narrow set of rules to follow, and I constantly felt that I couldn't be creative, or I couldn't think outside of
so rigid to a certain extent.
Yeah, it was very rigid. And when we went to international schools, there was kind of a broader way of thinking. There was just there was also an idea of global thinking, which I really liked. And so I found it very liberating to move to different places.
So as a child, are you the only child or do you have siblings?
I have an older brother.
So advantages to that?
Yeah, always. You can always blame the older sibling. They're the ones who led you down the wrong path. You didn't do it yourself. Yeah, so that was how I survived my childhood.
How was your upbringing?
No, my parents weren't very traditional in their upbringing or in our upbringing. I think it helped that we moved to different places, and so because they lived outside the community, I think they could kind of see how things functioned outside of just the group of people that they had grown up with. So in that way, I think it kind of expanded their views and their mindsets. About just about the way that they viewed things, but then of course they grew up in quite traditional households.
Right.
So I think that when you, no matter how much you consciously try to instill certain values in your kids, you're always gonna go back to the values that you grew up with. So I think sometimes my parents would say things that their own parents would say to them, and sometimes they would go, wait, what did I just say? and sometimes it was very much a knee-jerk reaction. So they kind of oscillated, I think, between traditional and modern, and I think it exists as a spectrum for most people anyway.
So for you and in your child, probably it would never happen.
That's what I tell myself, yeah. But sometimes I hear my mother's voice already talking through me, so I have to be careful.
Now you are a very creative person. You've written so many books. I want to talk to you about the books that you've written. Do you remember the very first time you wrote a story?
Yes, I think I do. I think the first story I wrote was probably for a school thing when I was when we were living in Tokyo, and I went to an American international school there.
Yeah.
And I think our teachers showed us that they used to read stories to us, and then they told us that those stories, like it was a Roald Dahl story, that story served as a good model for a story that we could write. And so then we created our own versions of the same story. I mean, it very much was the same story that we ended up writing.
But in your own words.
In our own words, with our own illustrations, and we put together a book, and our teachers took a photo of us, I think, as authors, and did a little bio, and I remember being very, very proud of that.
Do you think that was a catalyst?
I hope so. Yeah, I think so. Probably. I think there were moments like that where I definitely felt like this was something that I guess I felt most like myself. I felt like I knew myself most when I was writing. And I suppose that, having that final product was really exciting for all of us, whether or not we ended up becoming writers. And I think for all of us, it's really exciting having this completed work that was wholly our own.
I want to talk to you about your work, but let's take a short commercial break and come back. Balli Jaswal is our Woman in Focus today. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Women in Focus. As you can see, I'm holding two books in my hand. Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows. I think I'm going to read this one the first. And then The Unlikely Adventures of Shergill Sisters. As a writer, your very first book was not these. It was
Inheritance.
Inheritance. Tell me something about Inheritance.
So Inheritance is sort of my love letter to Singapore. It's about it's about the disappearance of a young Punjabi girl from her family home. She returns a couple of days later, but things have changed, and it's about the ripple effect of that one disappearance across generations or across decades.
Wow.
And essentially, it's about how this family has to grapple with its traditional views and its traditional ideas against a rapidly modernizing country, which is what Singapore was going through sort of between the 60s and the 90s, where there was this real change and real kind of very, very rapid modernization. And I think people were struggling to catch up.
Now, the history of Singapore is a beautiful place. I mean, we had the opportunity of visiting Singapore and filming in Singapore on our journey to India. And the one thing that stuck in my mind was that it was such a clean place. You couldn't even chew gum there. And I'm a gum chewing person. So and everybody is clean there. I mean, and there's a system for traffic as well, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a small place. So it is autonomous.
Yeah, it is, and it is. It's very systematic, and it is very well governed. I think, and I think with Inheritance, I wanted to explore that a little bit. I wanted to explore what happens to our innate humanness, the messiness, the complexity of human life, when we're all put in these boxes, and when we're all made to follow very rigid rules. What happens to our emotions and what happens to our relationships?
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
So now that book, you've got a lot of awards for books that you've written. So how did that make you feel?
It was great because it made me feel like this story that had been very private to me for a long time. It made me feel sort of validated. Inheritance was also my debut novel, so to have it kind of recognized and you know, being seen as, I guess, a novel deserving of a reward made me feel like I should continue to tell stories.
And so that took you to the journey of writing the next book. How long does it take you to write a book?
It's hard to say because my next book was actually a novel that I had started before I wrote Inheritance.
I see.
Sugar Bread, the next one to be published, was actually the first novel that I wrote, but I started writing it in university, and then I didn't know enough of how to construct a plot. So at the end of it, I realized that I had a lot of character. I had all the other elements, but I just didn't actually have a narrative. So I put it aside for a while and worked on Inheritance.
Right.
And then, so it was like 10 years later, I think, that I picked up Sugar Bread again. And, you know, over 10 years, you learn from reading, you learn from your own writing and your own mistakes.
Yeah.
And then I looked at that draft and I went, oh, I know what needs to be done now.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess I would say it took 10 years to write that book, but a lot of the writing was just going on kind of implicitly in my head.
When you see people around you, do they become characters in your book somehow?
Sometimes, yeah. Actually, there was a funny moment that someone on social media told me about, where she said that she was at a restaurant with her brother, and a group of Indian women came in and sat down, and they were being very noisy, and they were ordering the waiter around, and there was a lot of drama happening, and her brother turned to her and said, these women should be in a Balli Kaur Jaswal novel. So I think I'm starting a bit of a brand now with the sorts of characters that I create. But yeah, things that people say stick with me. Types of personalities and how people relate to each other. That to me is kind of fodder for creating characters.
I sometimes feel that writers somehow indirectly also become psychologists.
Yes, yeah.
Don't they?
Yeah, well, we have to have a lot of insight into human behavior, and also, like, you know, we put our characters through a lot. We put our characters through lots of challenges, and we have to anticipate what might happen to them, how they're going to come out on the other side of that. And that does, involve a lot of kind of study into human behavior.
So in your story, I'm asking you all sorts of silly questions. In your story, when you start writing a story, obviously you do not have the end to that in your mind, but there is a rough idea as to what the story is going to be about.
Yeah.
And it's never a murder mystery.
No, well, I do have a sense of the ending, actually. I do have a sense of where I want the resolution to take the character. So what journey I want them to go through. In particular, like what I want them to learn. That to me is more important. So how does the character change at the end of it?
So the growth of the character.
Yeah, the growth of the character. So I do have a vague sense of what that might look like, but then of course it changes as you write the novel. Yeah.
Now, the one that I showed to our viewers is erotic stories for Punjabi widows.
Yes.
I mean, I read that. It was the very first time when I was looking at it. Erotic stories of Punjabi.
Yeah.
So what is it? Is it for them or is it of them?
Well, it's quite funny because I went back and forth on that title quite a bit because
Did you
it's
really?
actually I knew I wanted most of those things to be in the title, but the for or the by or of, I wasn't sure, because it's actually a novel about a group of Punjabi widows in London who start an erotic storytelling club. So actually they are writing the stories. So it's actually, the stories are by them. However, the stories
For
are
other
for
women.
them. Yeah, they're for other, and they're also for themselves. They are writing and they are sharing. And because they start bringing up certain taboo topics, there are consequences to that. They start to then bring up other taboo topics in the community. So things like domestic violence and honor killings, things that they haven't been able to talk about before.
Right.
This experience empowers them to have those discussions. So there actually is a murder mystery in this one.
Oh, okay. I want to ask you a few more questions about this novel before I go to the next one, because I'm sure you're thinking about your fifth novel already.
Yeah.
We're talking to Balli Kaur Jaswal. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Balli Kaur Jaswal is our woman in focus today. So we're talking about erotic stories for Punjabi widows. How did you get the idea for this? And you mentioned just now that it is a murder mystery.
There is a murder mystery involved in it.
So we don't want to give away the story.
No, I have always been very interested in the things that are left unsaid, in especially among women in the Punjabi community. And I thought a lot about women like from my grandmother's generation who weren't really given much agency, and I thought about what that must have meant for other aspects of their lives, especially in terms of intimacy. Yes. I think there's always this thing that when you first find out about sex as a child, when you first find out about it, you think, oh God, my parents couldn't have done that, and you also think, oh God, that my grandparents definitely couldn't have done that. And I think that if you've had grandparents from such a traditional background, and where they really didn't show much affection for each other, in the ways that you kind of saw in the movies.
So you wonder
like what went on, right? So I think I was always abstractly curious about that. I don't think I thought about it too much, but I did have a curiosity about it. And then when I lived in England, I visited Southall a lot, and that's where that's a huge Punjabi immigrant settlement. It feels very much like you're in India when you get off the train. And it just felt like so many customs and traditions were preserved. And I remember thinking every time I went there, it must be so wonderful to have this, but it also must be quite stifling if you don't want this, if you want to get out and explore the rest of London, if you want to explore the British part of your identity.
And some of them just don't.
Yeah, so I think that place was really inspiring to me, and I found that conflict between wanting to stay. I always wanted to stay when I was there, but I also always wanted to. I was always relieved to leave. So that, combined with my curiosity, kind of sparked this novel.
Oh.
Yeah,
we lived in Hounslow.
Oh, okay. So
So I know.
Yeah, you're very aware.
And we were there in the 60s when it was like a bustling place.
Yeah.
And the last theatre, Odeon Theatre, was taken over by the Indians.
Oh.
And the Britishers had none for themselves. So that was a great time to be in England at that time, for the South Asian community especially. And this book, The Unlikely Adventures of the Shergill Sisters, has brought you here as well.
Yes.
And this seems like another very interesting book. Is this autobiographical or is this story?
No, I think as your novels, as you continue to write novels, I think you start off with writing what you know and writing things that are familiar to you. So my first two novels were set in Singapore, and then as I've advanced in my career, I've gotten a bit bolder and braver with exploring other people's stories and trying to do justice to them. So with this novel, I was really interested in the relationships between sisters. Because I don't have a sister myself, but I have a lot of friends who have sisters, and sometimes I'm friends with the sisters as well. And their dynamic fascinates me because it's so elastic in a way.
It is.
They can really stretch their limitations with each other. They can really anger each other. They can be brutally honest with each other. But then that bond is still there.
Yes.
So that's what I wanted to explore with this novel, which is about three British Indian sisters who go on a pilgrimage to Delhi and Punjab and some other places because their mother wants them to do some final rites on her behalf, because she's, as she's dying, she gives them a list of things she wants them to do. But as we all know, journeys, planned journeys, and planned journeys
never
with your
work.
family never go as planned. And she desperately wants them to spend time together and reconcile their differences.
Right.
And so there are a lot of things, there are lots of secrets between them
Yes.
that come up, and there are lots of internal secrets and lots of internal sort of grapplings with their own identities that come up in this trip to India.
So you must be a very imaginative person.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe able to imagine, or a very keen hearing for what's going around you.
Yeah, I think a lot of dialogue definitely comes from things that I hear, or I hear the dialogue in my head as I'm writing it, and
Right.
it has to really feel authentic to me.
What are you
Yeah.
working on right now?
So I'm actually, I've been joking with other people that I'm actually taking a break, or giving the Punjabi community a break. So I'm actually now writing a novel about 3 Filipina domestic workers in Singapore
Wow.
who band together to prove the innocence of another domestic worker who's been accused of murdering her employer.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
another dark comedy, kind of in the same vein as erotic stories, where it's about women coming together and fighting for justice.
So would you call yourself a feminist?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you are doing your part in helping the feminist movement,
I hope so.
writing about them, right?
Yeah.
And when you get time to meet the good-looking guy you married or have children.
I don't know when I had the time actually. I'm very fortunate. I have a husband who's very supportive of my writing, and so he always he knows that I have to carve out time for my writing, and
Right.
he knows how I get if I don't have time to write. So he and our child is a different thing. I don't think he quite understands that I need time, but he's only 2, so there's time to teach him that.
It's amazing to meet a person who has been in so many places. How was your trip to Australia? Did you find people over there as friendly as in Singapore?
Yeah, I mean, it's culturally things are different in a lot of ways, and also quite similar because we live in such a globalized world that
Right.
you can travel across the world, and sometimes you'll find a lot of the same things, or you could find the familiarities. Like you go to South Hall,
That's right,
and
I
you
know.
could pay in rupees at the pub, right? You can actually do that. So yeah, similarly, I think I found some aspects of Asian culture in Australia. I lived there for 6 years. My husband's
Wow.
from there.
I see.
So there's lots of things that I think have sort of migrated over there, and vice versa.
Is there a one similarity within the South Asian community wherever you have gone?
I guess the way our mothers shout at us.
The same, eh?
Same. Like anybody's mother shouts at them, I think I sit up straight because I think that's my mother.
It's been amazing talking to you. Thank you
too.
very much for being our Woman in Focus today.
Thank you for having me.
Balli Jaswal is our Woman in Focus today. Don't go away. We'll be right back.